Good evening, my name's Gregory. I'm from the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Most Canadians will surely know John McCrae's poem, In Flanders Fields, recited every Remembrance Day, in honour of those who fell during our nation's wars. But what we forget is that John McCrae was a medical officer who served with the Canadian Field Artillery. And he wrote that poem on the 3rd of May 1915, sitting on the back of an ambulance at Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station, where hundreds and thousands of wounded were treated for their wounds. In other words, what lies behind that extraordinary, vivid, moving poem? What lies beyond the sea of poppies waving in the wind is a crowded, complicated landscape of those who somehow survived the war. And those who survived that war are almost always erased from our memories and our books. John Keegan says that the wounded soldier, as soon as he falls, disappears from the story. And yet, as H.G. Hartnett wrote, remembering his own experience on the Western Front in the First World War, ahead of us and behind us, as far as the eye could see, a long column of walking wounded slowly made their way through the valley and across the ridges. From a distance, the khaki column resembled a huge brown snake crawling across the country. And what I've been doing over the last several years is trying to track that snake through war after war after war. Now, when we think of the First World War, we typically think of that churned charnel house no man's land, that ravaged strip between the two front lines. And what we forget is lying behind those front lines, behind the network of trenches, were fields, farms, villages, and towns, many of them inhabited as the fighting raged. And so, not surprisingly, there were civilian casualties, hit by shells, killed by bombs, injured by clouds of billowing gas. And those civilians were not the only civilians on the battlefield, because a whole host of humanitarian organisations took the field to provide medical support, including the Friends Ambulance Unit, the Red Cross, and the St John's Ambulance Brigade. So it was a crowded, complicated landscape. There's a sense in which modern war has always been war amongst the people. But in the First World War, we know that the vast majority of casualties were indeed soldiers, like those treated by John McCrae at Essex Farm. And we surely know that many of them, usually long after the event, set down what they remembered. And we can all look to the soldier poets, to novelists, people like Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, who conjure up a whole landscape of suffering. But there's often a very real difference between the immediacy and intimacy of the notes and jottings and letters that even they wrote at the time, and the polished prose which emerged several years later. And that difference resides in the obvious fact that trauma fractures narrative. Stories lose their coherence in the buzzing, blooming, teeming horror of war itself. And the horror on the Western Front was redoubled because there, essentially 19th century medicine collided with 20th century industrialized conflict. So military medicine had to radically reinvent itself, and fast. And it did so by constructing a medical military machine, one which had to cope with injuries to the body which were unprecedented. Emily Mayhew tells us that the Flanders casualty was almost torn apart, gone with the neat round holes made by rounded ammunition that flew slowly in the hot, dry African sun. She's thinking of the Boer War. Now she talks about the cylindro-conical bullet fired by the new powerful weaponry that hit fast and hard, went deep and took bits of dirty uniform and airborne soil particles with it. And as a result, one of the problems that compounded the extraordinary severity of the wound, that damage to that fleshy, baggy sac of the human body, was the spread of infection. And so for that reason, a premium was placed on moving medical care as close to the point of injury as possible and moving wounded soldiers rapidly through an evacuation chain. The first task was to find the wounded. Now, in a sense, of course, that was simple. During a major offensive, there were hundreds of them, thousands of them, all over no man's land. But nobody knew for sure where they were. And when darkness fell, when they crawled into shell holes, cowering in the water, in the slime, in the ooze, they cried for help, and they hoped that the regimental stretcher bearers would hear them, would crawl out under cover of darkness and retrieve their battered and broken bodies. They would then make a slow and painful journey down the trenches. This was compounded again and again and again by the broken, fractured terrain, ruined by the weapons of industrialized warfare. The rain has made the ground a sea of mud, wrote one stretcher bearer, and we have to carry the wounded 3 miles to the dressing stations. 2 men using stretcher slings couldn't carry a man 30 yards, and I've seen 4 bearers up to their knees in mud, unable to move without further assistance. Ultimately, they were taken to an advanced dressing station, where a medical officer would do his best to stop the bleeding and to splint up any obvious injuries. From there, the men would be loaded onto ambulances. But things didn't necessarily speed up once they were in the back of one of those trucks. George Carter wrote in 1916 of struggling with his load. Ammunition first, way for ammunition, is all he heard. The ambulances couldn't get through, he writes, even when they were not stuck in the mud and men were dying by the roadside, because that is the army rule. Ammunition before everything, wounded second. It was much more important to get the supplies, the bullets, the shells, and fresh meat up to the trenches than it was to evacuate the battered remains of war. But those ambulances would eventually rattle their way towards a casualty clearing station. And it was here, as close to the front line as they could safely be, that many of those men received their first full medical and surgical attention. It was here, too, that they first encountered female nurses. And from there, they would be taken several days later by ambulance train to a hospital on the French coast. The Private Lord Crawford tells an extraordinary story of taking his men, a party of stretcher bearers, down to the station to wait for the ambulance train. It was, as usual, late because these trains are always held up. They were a low priority because they were leaving the front. It was much more important to make space and time for all of those trains bringing fresh recruits and supplies up to the front. And he describes a train pulling through the station, full of fresh-faced young boys, kids really, hanging out of the windows, shouting, screaming, full of excitement, singing songs. The train goes through the station, there's a hiss of brakes, a hiss of steam. The train slowly backs into the station. And Crawford says, one by one, all of those carriages fell silent as those boys looked across the platform and they saw the occupants of those stretchers, covered with mud and blood, still wearing their boots. Suddenly, he says, this whole trainload of new soldiers was startled into silence. For the first time, these men were in the presence of the real thing. But even when they were on the train, things didn't speed up. The nearer you get to the front, wrote one of the nurses on those trains, the longer it takes, as trains are always having to shunt and go round loops to make room for supply trains. Ultimately, they would arrive at a base hospital. But they might have to go from one base hospital to another because the first one was too full. Only the most seriously injured, those who were not expected to make the journey to the next available hospital, were offloaded. And even at those hospitals, it could take several hours to unload a full ambulance train, which meant that that journey from being wounded to a hospital on the coast could occupy days and even weeks. But there was something mechanical about the whole process. Here's Private Alfred Arnold describing how one train came into one of those base hospitals and he saw it being emptied of our wounded at the front and being filled at the back with yet more wounded who were going to be taken down to the docks and sent by hospital ship to Britain and Canada and beyond. Now that's an extraordinary chain involving all sorts of people and materials. And Arthur Empey says that when you realise that all the ambulances, trains and ships, not to mention the manpower used in transporting a wounded man, could be used for supplies, ammunition and reinforcements, it will not appear strange that from a strictly military standpoint, a dead man is sometimes better than a live one if he's wounded. And for those that were wounded, what lay ahead? I ask you to think of the care or the non-care that was provided for those wounded in these wars. Here's Kate Luard trying to cheer up a young soldier who's lost his arm, amputated at one of those casualty clearing stations. I told him what splendid new arms soldiers would get now, and everyone would give them the best possible jobs, like messengers and commissionaires, before civilians, and his brow cleared at the rosy vision. I only hope it's true, she wrote to her family. Is it? This is perhaps the moment to fast forward 100 years and think about what has changed and what hasn't. Now, the route from the point of injury to the point of what's called definitive care is measured in hours and at most 2 or 3 days. But here we're dealing with a radically complicated world. When we think about Afghanistan, we're not dealing with a linear battle space, a world of fronts and supply lines. We're dealing with a profoundly non-linear battle space. But it's a battle space which has been transformed by a new medical geography. We now know, for example, that those hours and days that it took the wounded to reach serious medical care are precious days wasted. So much depends on what can be done by a combat medical technician and by a soldier's buddies in the platinum 10 minutes of life-saving care. But then we've refined the concept of the golden hour. It becomes crucial to get the wounded to definitive care within 60 minutes. If we can do that, their chances of survival soar. It's much harder, though, to recover the experience of those caught up in these evacuation chains, because unlike the First World War, where soldiers are writing notes, jottings in their diary, even letters to their family, many of them, for much of this period, today's soldiers are sedated. And so we have to find new ways of recovering their stories. And it's important to do that, not just so that we understand the continuing new horror of war, but for soldiers themselves, it's important as part of their process of recovery and rehabilitation to understand what has happened to them during that precarious journey. And I want to share with you 2 innovative attempts to do just that. The first is from a book by Brian Kastner, himself a veteran, called All the Ways We Kill and Die. And in that book, he tells the story of a friend of his, US Air Force Technical Sergeant Daniel Fye, who stepped on an IED during clearance operations in Panjwai in May 2011. This is an imaginative reconstruction drawn from his conversations with his friend. They worked on Fye a long time. The longer they worked, the more anxious he got about the precious minutes slipping away. I don't hear the bird, he said, over and over. And eventually he heard the thumping of the rotors. Fye thought it was the most wonderful sound he'd ever heard. They were at the extreme limit of the NATO footprint. So it was a 60-kilometre flight to the main hospital in Kandahar. If they moved quickly, Fye would just make it in the magic golden hour. Now, in a sense, he was fortunate to be wounded when he was, because in 2007, the International Security Assistance Force produced an extraordinary map of its medical evacuation coverage using helicopters calibrated on a 2-hour interval between the point of injury and surgery. That way they could cover most of Afghanistan. But when it came to the golden hour, as soon as that was factored in, the coverage shrank. And that takes into no account the sheer difficulty of flying helicopters in the high, fractious, hot air over Afghanistan. It also doesn't take into account the problems of miscommunication. When Fye got on board that helicopter, he was surprised to find that nobody on board paid any attention to him. But the reason was that there were no medics on board. This wasn't a medical evacuation. His platoon had repeatedly called for help on the basis of Fye suffering bilateral amputations, but that got scrambled over the radio to bilateral lacerations. It wasn't a medical emergency. Nobody bothered. So it was his good fortune that that helicopter dropped out of the skies and saved his life. So medical evacuation times are crucial, and they've speeded up dramatically so that over the last 5 years or so, most of those flights are now, for all sorts of reasons, within the so-called golden hour, which means that wounded soldiers can receive definitive care very rapidly at level 3 trauma centres, at Bagram, at Camp Bastion, at Kandahar and elsewhere. And from there, they can be placed on board medical transport planes, and following the American line of evacuation, they can go via Landstuhl Regional Medical Centre, the largest American medical facility outside the United States, and from there on to Walter Reed National Medical Centre in the United States. Now that's a remarkably elongated evacuation chain compared to anything you would have found in the First World War, but at the same time, it's remarkably compressed. Everything is speeded up. But another way of telling the experience of those who go down that evacuation chain is to be found in an extraordinary novel written by Harry Parker, which tells the story of Captain Tom Barnes, a British Army officer who steps on an IED while on patrol in Afghanistan. The IED blows one leg off, he's evacuated, and the other leg is surgically removed. Now, this is an extraordinary novel because Harry Parker stepped on an IED in Helmand province in July 2009. He lost one leg in the blast, was evacuated, and had the other leg surgically removed. And he confronts exactly the problem that I raised a few moments ago. Not only does trauma rupture language, but memory is fleeting. Consciousness ebbs and flows. I never knew quite the full story, he says, because obviously I was eyes shut, gritting teeth. I was conscious, I thought, for all of it. But then 10 days later, someone told me we had to start your heart 5 times. In hospital, you're propped up by drugs. It's quite unreal. So to recover that experience, Parker tells the story in a series of chapters, and each chapter is narrated by an object, by the tourniquet which was used to staunch the flow of blood from his severed limb, by the tube inserted into his throat at Camp Bastion, by the surgical saw which removed his leg, by a plasma bag, by a catheter, by a wheelchair, by his series of prosthetics. It's an extraordinarily effective way of telling that story, because what it reminds us is that in war, the body becomes an object space, not for the person that it contains and the person who exceeds that body, but for all of those involved in managing that body, it becomes an object. So too, even his first prosthetics. You improved on me, but you became thinner. The pressure I exerted on you, the weight you lost from the energy I used, made your stump shrink. I could no longer support you properly. And what you have there is this intimate relationship between the material world of objects and the fleshy world of the soldier's body. Of course, it's precisely that engagement which, in a sense, injures the body of Harry Parker, but it's also those intimate engagements which ultimately will also save the body of Harry Parker. But I started out by talking about those civilians on the Western Front. And I said most of the casualties were soldiers. But we need to understand that one of the characteristics of late modern war is that it, more than any previous war perhaps, is war amongst the people. And that many of those who are injured and killed during the war are civilians. In Afghanistan, between 2001 and 2016, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 American and Allied troops have been killed. That compares against a minimum estimate of 33,000 Afghan civilians. 23,000 American and Allied troops have been wounded, compared with over 40,000 Afghan civilians. In other words, 10 times as many Afghan civilians were killed and twice as many were wounded. And that difference is in part because those Afghan civilians have a much more restricted access to medical care. The numbers of soldiers killed in modern wars has gone down and down and down. But that's because the number of wounded has gone up and up and up. Because now medical science and those extraordinary casualty evacuation chains means that many more survive. But when you look at Afghan civilians who are denied access to that priority medical care, to that high-speed medical evacuation, the difference is extraordinary. And so we know that the military medical machine in Afghanistan does treat civilians. It does evacuate them from conflict zones. But we also know that owing to its own rules of eligibility, the rules of the game say that as soon as possible, Afghans must be cared for by Afghans. And that means that they're immediately removed from this high-tech world of late modern medicine towards a radically different world. And it's in an attempt to fill some of the gaps in the Afghan medical system that other humanitarian agencies, very different from those that operated on the Western Front, organisations like MSF, have tried to plug the gap with their trauma centre. So, for example, we here need to confront the ways in which hospitals, particularly those which claim to treat all sides in a war, have become targets for military violence. They're no longer safe havens. And you think of the MSF Trauma Centre in Kunduz, which was bombed in October 2015. Shot at repeatedly for over 30 to 40 minutes by an AC-130 gunship. Now, I'm quite sure that for the American Special Forces on the ground and for those in the gunship, this was the product of a concatenation of mistakes and errors. It wasn't, from their part, deliberate, but they were relying on intelligence supplied to them by Afghan Special Forces. And I've got no doubt that the information that they fed to the Americans was deliberate. They couldn't stomach the fact that MSF was there treating not only civilians, but the Taliban. But for those who survive the trauma centre, those who are treated successfully by those humanitarian agencies, what future waits for them? And here we need to compare the extraordinary prosthetics made available to people like Harry Parker. And I don't mean to diminish the horror and the trauma that they've suffered, but compare those prosthetics, the arms and the legs that are available to those men and women with what's available to Afghanistan today. And you can see the ghosts of the First World War and the prostheses which were offered to soldiers then, which they saw as a rosy prospect, according to Kate Luard. You can see those ghosts stalk the world today. So when we think of bodies at war today, we need to honour the bodies of the soldiers, because soldiers, after all, are not just vectors of violence, they're also the victims of it. And I have no time for that lazy politics which says that the left cares about their civilians and the right cares about our soldiers. As Anne insisted, the bodies of the soldier and the civilian are intimately entwined, but we should never forget the bodies of the civilians too. Thank you.